So, a few days ago, the Next.js team held its yearly Next.js Conf. And inside of this conference, they have now finally released Next.js 14. And I will admit, there's not a lot of new things, but there's one interesting thing, and that's that Next.js server actions are now finally stable. And now the question arises, how the hell do I use Next.js server actions? And that's why I've created this video today, so you can learn how to use them. So in this video, I want to talk about what are server actions, how do I use server actions, how do I revalidate data, how do I show a pending state, how do I do error handling, and also I want to show you how to clear form submissions after your form has been submitted. So that's all what we'll do today, so strap in and let's go. So if you can remember, before we had this whole Next.js server action in the Next.js 13 release, we would manually create API routes. And the nice thing with server actions is that we don't have to do that anymore. We can now create asynchronous functions inside of our component, and with that we can then mutate our data. So now what's the nice thing with server actions? Well, server actions can be defined inside of a server component, or they can be called inside of a client component. And now the nice thing with server actions is if I use them inside of a server component, the whole form submission works without any JavaScript, so 0 KB. That's very nice, and that's why I really like to use them, and also because they're very easy to write actually. You don't have to do all of this boilerplate for API routes, you only create a async function and boom, you have your server action. And now where I've talked a bit about server actions, I think we can now start with the fun stuff and create some actual server actions. So let's go. So to get started, I will cd into my desktop directory, cd into my YouTube directory, and then inside of here I will run npx create-next-app@latest since I want to install the latest package of Next.js. The CLI will now ask me for name, so let's name it Next.js server actions YouTube. Then I will use TypeScript, I will use ESLint, I will use Tailwind. I won't use the source directory since we will use the app router, and then I won't customize the default import alias. Now the installation will take a few seconds, so once that's done, I will come back. So the CLI has now finally installed Next.js, and I can now go to my Visual Studio Code, and as you see I already opened the project. And if you want to do the same, click right here on File and then click on Open Folder. But right now we just have a default template, and as you see it's pretty much empty and we don't have anything. We can also see that if we start our dev server, so let's open the terminal. You can either use Command J or you can go on top and click on terminal and new terminal. But inside of here let's run npm run dev. This will now start our dev server noclose 3000, so let's open that. So as you see we now have the default template that Next.js ships with. And we don't want to leave it like that. We want to create a basic to-do application, and then with the to-do application we can test out server actions. So to create a to-do, to edit a to-do, and to delete a to-do. So I think let's do that, and before we can actually start with the UI, I want to install a few things. So for that let's stop our dev server and let me clear everything. And then I want to install Prisma. And why do I need Prisma? That's because I want to query my database from Supabase. That's right, we'll use Supabase for our database. And then inside of our database, we'll store our to-dos and at the end also manipulate them. So for that, let's install Prisma. So let's do an npm I -capitalize D Prisma. And with that, I install the development dependency of Prisma. And the development dependency means that this dependency or the size of this dependency will not show up in our production build. Also, I need to install @prisma /client, and this will now be a normal dependency which will show up in our production bundle. So once that's installed, we can now initialize Prisma with npx prisma init. And this again will just initialize Prisma, and you can see that we have now created two files, one .environment variable file with a default database URL and a Prisma folder with an empty schema. Let's first of all create a database at Supabase, so let's go to supabase.com. So I'm now at supabase.com, and as already said, Supabase is what we'll use for our database provider, But Supabase is much more than a database provider. Actually, they are a full-fledged open source Firebase alternative, and that means that they have a Postgres offering, authentication, instant APIs, edge functions, real-time subscriptions, and storage. But for us, we only need our Postgres database. But if you want to check it out, go to supabase.com. And now we can click right here on dashboard, and if you don't have an account, create one. And then let me click on new project. I will choose this organization. Let's choose a name. Let's just name it Next.js server actions. Then I will have to generate a password right here. And I will also copy that since we will need it in a second. I will just paste it right now in my .env file. Then for the region, I will choose Frankfurt, and Frankfurt is the nearest to me, but you should choose the one that's nearest to you. Now I can click on create new project. This will now take a bit, about 2 minutes. So once that's done, I will come back. So great, Supabase has now finally initialized. So now I can click right here on project settings. Then I can click on database, and then if I scroll down, we now have our connection string. So let me click on URI since we will need that, and let me copy that. If I now go back to my .environment variable, I can delete this default database URL since we now have an actual database URL and paste that. Now you will see right here we have an option to paste our password, and I've copied that right here as you see. So let me copy that again, and now let's change this your password to the actual password. So that looks good, and now we can actually continue and create an actual schema. Now for the schema, this will be absolutely a simple schema. We'll just create one model. We'll call it to do, and let's open that. We'll have to give it an ID as always. This will be in string. Let's give it an @ which will be ID, and at default which will be UUID. And with the UUID, I just create a unique identifier, and I don't have to do anything myself. Prisma will create one by itself. What else do we need? I want to have an input, and the input is just a different name for our to-do message, and this will be of type string. And I also want to have an created at timestamp, since I want to later on pretty much sort my to-dos by date. So this will be of type date time, and let's give it an at default of now. And with now, I just tell Prisma to create a new timestamp when I create a new record. So that now looks good. So let's push our schema to our database. And for that, let's open the terminal and run npx prisma db push. And with that, I just push my current schema to our database at Supabase. You now see our database is in sync with our Prisma schema. So that looks good. But now we're still not done. We have now created our schema, that looks good, but we have to create a Prisma client with which we can then query our database. And since we use Next.js, which uses HMR, so hot module reloading, we have to create a global Prisma instance in the development environment. So if you go to Google right now and just Google Next.js best practices Prisma, just like that, let me search that. And if I open the first right here result, you will see best practices for initializing Prisma client with Next.js. And you see right here the problem, and it tells us lots of users have come across this warning while working with Next.js. And the warning is that Prisma client, there are already 10 instances of Prisma client actively running. So that means each time we have hot module reloading, it will generate a new Prisma client instance, which is actively running. And you don't want to do that in the development environment. You only want to have one global Prisma client. So right here you have a solution, and that's just to check if you're not inside of the production environment, then you can create a global Prisma file, global Prisma instance, I'm sorry. So let me just copy this right here, and then let's go back. Let me open the Explorer, and then inside of the app folder, I will create a new file called db.ts, and inside of here, I can now paste the code. And again, we just check if we're in a production environment or if we are actually not in a production environment. And if we are not, we create a global Prisma file. And if we are in a production environment, we create the normal Prisma client. So now that looks good. We have now finally created Prisma and it's working. So what we can do now is actually start with the fun stuff, which is the UI and the server actions. So for that, let me go inside of this page.tsx for now, and let me actually delete everything. I don't want this default template, I don't need it. And then let me just return a h1 and let's say hello from the index page to see if everything works. For that, let me again open my terminal, let me clear everything, and let's run npm run dev to start my dev server on localhost 3000. So if I go back to localhost 3000, this will now open in a second. So as you see now, we have this hello from the index page. That looks alright, but right now we have a black background. I don't want that, so let's change that. For that, I will now open the globals.css file. Let me delete everything after this add tailwind classes, so everything this root and body. And let's create a new styling. So body, I want to target the body and give it a background color of white. So if I now go back, we now see a white background, and I think that's much easier to read. So now I think we can actually create our form to create our to-dos. So let's do that. Let me delete this return statement and let me just create a new return statement. Then let's create a div element. Let's give it a class name and let's give it some default styling of h screen, w screen, flex, items, center, and justify center. With this, I just tell all of the child elements of this div element to just group in the middle of the screen. So we give it a height of 100 viewport height, width of 100 viewport height, and then flex of item center and justify center. Then inside of here, let's create a child div. Let's give it a class name, which will just be border rounded of LG, shadow of, let's say, XL. I have to spell that correctly, so let's do that. And let's also give it a padding of 10. And I want to give this div element a custom width. So let's give it a width with these custom array brackets. So with these array brackets, I can give it a custom value, and the custom value will be 30 VW, so 30 viewport width. If I now create inside of this div an h1 to see it, I will just say hello, save that and go back. You'll now see right here, we have now this div element with a border and a shadow. But I don't want this h1, so let me delete that. This was just for demo purposes. Inside of here, let me create a normal form element, and I won't need this action right now, so let me just delete it. I will use it later on. And let me also give it a class name. So the class name will be flex, and let's give it a flex of call. Also inside of here, I want to now create an input. The input will be of type text, and let me also give it a name. And the name will just be called input, and that looks good. If I now save that and go back, you will now see actually nothing. And that's weird, right? We have just created an input. And that's because of Tailwind CSS magic, or not magic. Tailwind CSS buffers, or not buffers, but default styles our input as actually nothing, so we don't see it. I can of course click it and type it, and now you see our input, but the default style of Tailwind CSS is that the input is actually not styled at all. So let's change that and give it some class names. So let's give it a class name of border and a padding of 1. If I now save that and go back, you now see that the input is much more defined. Also, I can change the color, so we can give it a border of, let's say, gray 800. And if I now save that and go back, you now see that the border is much more pronounced and the input itself is much more pronounced. So the input looks good. I now want to have a button, which will be a submit button. So let's give it a type, and the type will be submit. And let's also give it a name, which will again just be submit. I now get an error. If I hover over type, it tells me type submit is not assignable to these types. And that's because I have uppercase submit while it should be lowercased. If I now save that and go back, we now have a button, I guess, even though it does not look like a button. And that's again because of default Tailwind CSS styling. So let's change that. Let's give it some class names. So let's give it a class name of BG green 500, rounded, which will be large, margin top, which will be 2, text, which will be white, and padding Y, which will be 2. If I now save that and go back, yeah, this button now actually looks like a button. So I think that looks quite good. And now, why do I use this type submit right now? Well, that's because I want to have this button as our submit button. So this button is inside of the form. And if I give it a type of submit, that's the button which will submit our form. And right now, if I write something inside of my input and submit it, you will actually see nothing. That's because we have this form right now as a GET request. And that's why you see right here inside of the URL, this input, which equals our input. That's because we made a GET request and not a POST request. That's what we want to do with server actions. So let's change that now and actually create our server actions so that we can submit our to-dos to our database. And now the fun thing with server actions, or the cool thing, is that it's actually very easy to do. It's actually just an async function if you think about it. So how do you create a server action? So let's go right here inside of our export default function and let's just create a async function. We'll have to give it a name. So let's just name it create. And then I just open this function. So now this is still not a server action. Right now it's just an async function. And to make it a server action, we have to use this keyword, which is called use server. And with that, I now use server actions. So we just use a normal async function, mark it as use server, and with that, we create a server action which exclusively runs on the server and never on the client. Now, one more thing I want to do is get through the params form data. So let's get form data. I now get an error and it tells me right here, form data is declared, it's never used, that's okay. But parameter form data has a type of any. So let's give it a type, and the type will just be form data. Now we have types and no errors anymore. Now what do I want to do inside of the server action? Well, I want to get the input and then post it to my database. If I now go back, that's the input, and I want to get the message which I write in here. And that's actually quite easy. I get this input through my form data. So what I have to do is create a constant. Let's name it input, and this will be equal to form data. And now I want to get something from my form data. And for that, we have created a name inside my input. And I want to get now my input based on this name. So I can do now a form data dot get, and I want to get something based on the name of input. Now with this, I just get the input, so the message which I write inside of this input element with the name of input. I could also change the input name to hello, and then I could get this form data through the name hello. But I don't want that. Let's leave it to input. That looks good. So now I think we can actually post our data to our database. So for that, let's do an await Prisma, and Prisma has to be imported from our DB file, not from Prisma client, dot to do dot create. So let's create a new record, and I have to pass some data, and I have to pass the input, and the input will just be equal to our input. Now I get an error right here, and it tells me type null is not assignable to type string. So let's give our input a type of as string. Now I get no errors anymore, and that looks good. So still it won't work. We now have to actually connect our async function, or our server action actually, to our form. And for that, I will now use this keyword action, or the property action. And the action will just be equal to our create function. So now our form is actually connected to this server action, which is called create. And we can actually test out if it works. So let me go back. Let me delete this gibberish. And let's say go get some milk. If I now click on submit, yeah, well, you don't see anything, right? Kinda weird. But that's because actually we don't render right now our to-dos. So let's do that. So what I want to do now is get my data from my database and then just render it down below. So on top of my export default function, let me just create a async function called get data, and let me open that function. Inside of here, let me do a constant data, which will be equal to await prisma.todo dot find many, since I want to find many to-dos. And let me also select a few things. I only want to get the input, so let's do input true, and I want to get the ID, so ID of true. Now again, also if you can remember, we also have this created at property, and I want to now order my to-dos by the created at timestamp. So let's do an order by, and I want to order by created at, and it should be descending. That means that I want to get the most recent to-dos first, and then all other ones based on the date, I guess. Now right here we now write our query. Let's also return that data. So let's do return data. Now I also have to get it right here in my server component. So for that I will just do const data, and this will be equal to await get data. Now I get an error, and the cool thing is it already gives me a fix. Did you mean to mark this function as async? And yes, I will have to mark it as async since I want to use it right here as a server component and fetch data. So this will be now an export default async function. So now we have the server component and I get also data. So now I think let's map over the data and show it. So let's go under our form element right here and let's create a new div element. Let's give it a class name, and this will just be margin top of 5, flex which will be call, and gap y of 2. Now inside of here I want to map over my to-dos. So let's do data.map. Let's get the to-do and let me return that. Now inside of here I can now just simply return a p tag, and let's just say to-do.input. If I now save that, we still get an error and it tells me missing key prop. Well, yes, that's a React error. So let's give it a key prop, and the key will be to-do.id. Now, why do you have to give it a key? That's just to prevent any hydration error messages inside of the console. If I now save that and go back, you now see our message, go get some milk. Now let me create another to-do. Let's just say go shopping. If I now click submit, yeah, I'm waiting, nothing happens. Well, that's quite weird, right? Because if I now reload the page, you will actually see our response right here, go shopping. But why did it not revalidate automatically? Well, that's because we have to revalidate our cache. You can actually also see that if I now open my network tab and create a message. So let's say again, hello, how are you? And click on submit. You right here see actually that we create a post request, but we don't invalidate our cache, which means that we don't see the message right here. So what we have to do actually is use a handy function provided by Next, which is called revalidate path. So under this await Prisma to do, I want to now use this revalidate path function provided by Next cache, and you have to import that right here. So import revalidate path from next/cache. And now I have to pass a URL which I want to revalidate. And since everything right now happens on the index page, I want to revalidate our index page, which is just the slash symbol right here. If I now save that and go back, and let me change it to, let's say, go buy some shoes, and click submit, you will see it will automatically revalidate for us, and we see the to-do automatically without doing anything or without even refreshing the page. So now we see everything works. So now you see we have now created a very basic server action. We just create a async function, we give it a name, we pass our form data through the props to get some inputs. We also explicitly mark it as useServer. With this useServer keyword, I tell React that I want to make it a server action and not just a normal async function which runs on the client. Then I get the input from our form data. I then do some work with Prisma to create a post request. And at the end, I use a handy function provided by Next.js to revalidate my cache, I guess. So again, with this revalidate path, I just tell Next.js, hey, revalidate the cache for this URL. If I would now be on the URL, I don't know, /abc, I wouldn't use just a normal slash right here, but I would use /abc, since this would now be then the correct URL. But since we use the index page, this will just be the normal slash. Now, if I go back, right now, this is just a normal p tag. But I also want to use a delete button, and I also want to use a edit button so that the user can edit the to-do and make it something else, I guess. And now to do that, that's actually very simple. Let me delete this p tag. I won't need it anymore. Let's create a form element. I won't need an action right now, so let me delete this action. Let me give it a key prop, and this will just be a to-do.id. Let me also give it a class name, which will be flex. Now inside of this form, let me create a input, and the input will be of type text. Let me give it a name, and the name will just be input. And I want to give it a default value, and the default value will be to-do to-do.input. Now again, let's also give it a class name, since if I now save it and go back, you will again see we don't see any styling. Even though the input works, we don't really see that that's an input. So let me give it a class name of border and border, or not border, but padding of 1. If I now save that and go back, now you see that this is actually an input and that the user can click on it. Now let's create 2 buttons, one to save our input and one to delete our input. So for that, go under your input and let's create a button. Let's say save, and let's give it a class name, which will be of border. Let's give it an BG of green of, let's say, 400, and let's leave it like that. If I now save it and go back, you now see a button with save. That looks quite alright. Let's also create a delete button. So under this button, let's create another button. Let's say delete. Let me spell that correctly. And let's also give it a class name, which will be border. And let's also give it a BG of red, and let's say 400. If I now save that and go back, we now have 2 buttons. One is save and one is delete. Now still both buttons don't work. If I click either one, you see nothing actually happens. So now what do I want to do? If I submit this form, so if I click the save button, I want to save my input. So let's give it a type, which will be called submit, since I want to submit the form with this button. Now for the delete button, we will do something else, but for now let's just leave it like that, and let's just give the save button a type of submit. Now again, what do we have to do? We have to create a server action. So let's go on top and right under our async function create, let's create a new server action, and let's name it async function. Let's give it a name of edit. Then inside of the params, let's again get the form data, which will be of type form data. And let me open that function. Now inside of here, again, let's give it the keyword of use server, since I want it to be a server action. And then inside of here, let me again get the input. So let's do a const input, which will be equal to form data dot get, and I want to get the input. Now there's one thing right now, if I want to update a to-do, so right now I want to update a specific to-do, I also have to get the input ID of this input message. So to do that, let's create another input right here, and this will now be an input of type hidden. Let's give it a name of input ID, and let's give it a value, which will just be to-do.id. Now with this input hidden, I can now get this value, so this to-do ID, through my form data. So let's create another constant. Let's name it input ID, which will be equal to form data.get, and this will be equal to input ID. I can now do my Prisma query. So let's do an await Prisma .todo.update, since I want to only update a specific to-do. And then inside of here, I have to say where that is, and the where is equal ID to our input ID. I now get an error, and it tells me again type null is not assignable to type string or undefined. So let's give it right here an as string, and also let's give our input a as string. So now what you have to do, I also have to pass the data which I want to update, and this will just be right here data. And then right here we'll just have the input, and the input will be equal to our input. Now let's save that. Let's also use the revalidate path function, since I want to revalidate my cache. And the revalidate path function will again just get our index page, which is an empty slash. I can now save that, and we now again have to create a connection between our form and our server action. So let's scroll down and let's give our form a action, and the action will be equal to edit. So now if I save that and go back, we can check that out if it works. So instead of go buy some shoes, let's say go buy some, I don't know, what can you buy? Some bags, I guess. And let me save that. So now it has revalidated automatically, and if I reload the page, you still see everything keeps persisted. I can again change it to, let's say again, shoes, and if I click on save and reload the page, it's still the same, which is go buy some shoes. So now our save button fully works, which is great. Now let's make our delete button work. So for that we'll create another server action. So let's do an async function delete and let me open that function. Now you see I get an error and it tells me identifier expected. Delete is a reserved word that cannot be used here. That's correct. You can't use delete as a name for a function since that's a reserved keyword. So let's just change it to delete item, I guess. That is also fine. Then inside the params, let's again get the form data. And this will then have a type of form data. Yeah, that looks good. And then inside of here again, we have to explicitly tell React that this async function shall be a server action. So let's use the keyword, which is use server. And now what do I want to do inside of here? I want to get our input ID and then delete our to-do based on the input ID, which is a unique identifier. So let's create a constant. Let's call it input ID. And this will be equal to form data.get, and I want to get the input ID. Now what do I want to do is an await prisma.todo.delete, and I only want to delete a singular to-do. That's why I use delete and not delete many. Then inside of here I have to say where that is, and where will be ID equal to input ID. Now I again get an error because it does not know if it's in type string. So let's right here do an as string. So that looks good. Now the last thing I want to do is again revalidate my cache. So let's do a revalidate path and let's pass our index page. Now again, we have to create a connection between our form and our server action. But now if you can remember, it won't work. Why? That's because we already have a form with an action and a button of type submit. And I can't have two actions inside of this form element. So what you can do is a nice little trick and give our button, so our delete button, a form action. And the form action will be delete item. And with that, I don't have to create a separate form, but I can make everything work inside of one form, and I can just then give this button a separate form action. So now in theory, this should work. So let's go back and let me delete this right here, go get some milk. And you see it has automatically revalidated, so the cache got automatically revalidated. And if I reload my page right now, you see it has been actually also deleted from my database. You can also see that in the network tab. So let me open my network tab and let me delete right here, go buy some shoes. If I delete it and click right here, you see we made a post request to delete our item from our database. So we now basically understood how to use server actions. You create a async function, you give it a name, you get the form data through the params if you need it. You don't necessarily need it if you don't want it. You have to, now that's very important, you have to explicitly mark this async function as use server. Because if you don't mark it as a use server, React will just think that this is a normal async function which should run on the client. You don't want that. You want this function to explicitly run on the server so that you can at the end use a server action. Then inside of this server action, you can do whatever you want. So get something through form data, manipulate something, or I don't know, console log something if you want to do that. And then if you want to use a handy function to revalidate your data, you can use this revalidate path function provided by Next.js. And with that, you can then revalidate the path, so revalidate the cache to see the new result that you have just posted to your database, for example. So this is the very basic example of how to use server actions. But now there's the thing, right? We create a to-do right here. And if I click on submit, you get the result right here as you see. But now there's a few things I don't like. First of all, when I clicked on submit, it did not show me a pending state. Also, it did not reset my input right here. It should automatically reset my input once I click submit. Also, if I now click on delete, I don't see any pending state. And if I change my to-do right here to some gibberish and click on save, I again don't see any pending state. So let's actually change that and let's create a better version of this example right here, where we show the pending state, where we show or where we reset the form actually, where we do error handling. And yeah, so let's actually do that right now. To do that, I will actually create another route. So inside of the app folder, let's create a new folder called beta. And then inside of this folder, I will create a page.tsx. Now inside of this page.tsx, I will create a beta example so that you can then compare both examples. So what we will do right now is go to our page.tsx and let's just copy everything inside of this return statement. So let me copy that and let me paste it now inside of here. So first of all, because I can't just paste it, let's create a export default function and let's name it beta example, and let me open that function right now. Inside of here, I can now create a return statement and paste what I've just copied from our original page.tsx. Now right here I get a few errors, that's fine, we'll fix that in a second. First of all, what I want to do is get our data. So let's again go back to page.tsx. And what I want to do is just copy right here our async function, which is called getData. Let's go back and let's just paste it right here on top. Then right here inside of our export default function, let's do a const data equals to await getData. Again, we have to mark our function as async. So let's do an async export default async function. Also right here, let's import Prisma from our DB file. So now that looks good. We now get our data from our database and we still get a few errors, but that's fine. We'll fix that in a second. Now, if you want to, you of course can go to your normal page.tsx and just copy each server action and paste it inside of the page.tsx. But I don't like this approach. I actually would prefer to do it a bit differently. What you can actually create is a new file and then just store all of your server action in one global file where you can access it then, and in my opinion it's just a much cleaner architecture. So what I want to do is go inside of my Explorer and then inside of my app folder create a new file called action.ts. Now inside of this action.ts, I want to store all of my server actions. So let's go to our page.tsx and let me copy all server actions. So async function delete item, async function edit, and async function create. I will copy them and now inside of my action.ts, I will paste them inside of here. Let me also export all of these functions. So export function create, let's do an export function edit, and let's do an export function delete item. Let me also import Prisma right now from our DB file, and let me import the revalidate path function from next/cache. So now this action.ts file works. As you see, everything is imported and we don't get any errors anymore. Now inside of my page.tsx, I could now just edit all of these server actions. So add import from /action. Let's also import edit right now from /action. And let's import delete item from /action. If I now save that and go back and go now to our new route, which is called /beta, and go right here, you will now see everything still works, which is good. Now there's one thing I want to change right now. We right now revalidate the path for our index page, which is called /. But I want to now revalidate the path, which is /beta. So let's change that for each server action, /beta, and also right here, /beta. That looks fine. So now let's test out if it works. So let's create an input of, let's say, hey, how are you? And let me click on submit. And yeah, you see it right here. Hey, how are you? So now we see that this actually works. We revalidate our data or our cache, and you see the to-dos right here. Now let's actually do the first thing, which is to create a pending state. Let's start with the save button. So let me open my Explorer. Let's go inside of the app folder and let's create a new folder called components. Now inside of the components folder, let's create a new file called savebutton.tsx. And then inside of here, I want to now get the pending state and then show that in the button. So to do that, let's create again an export default function. Let's name it savebutton. And let me just open that function. Inside of here, I want to now return a button. Or actually, let me just go back and let me copy this button and let me paste it right here. So instead of creating a new one, let's just use what we already have. So now we have this button, and if I go back and just import that, so let's import the save button and go back and save that. And if I now create a message or change it actually, so let's say, hey, how are we? And save that, reload the page, you see it works. So now we have just broken this button inside of a component, but inside of this component, I now want to get the pending state. And now why did I have to break this button inside of a component? And that's because we will get our pending state through a hook, and this hook has to be hydrated on the client. So we have to mark this file as use client. So on top, let's do an use client. And now inside of here, we can import const, we can the structure pending, and this will be equal to use form status. Now again, use form status and not use form state. Be sure that you import the correct one, and it's imported from react-dom. Now we can use this pending state to actually get the message if currently our button is in a pending state or not. So instead of save, let me right here do ternary. So if pending is true, let's do a question mark, and let's say right here, saving ... And if this is not true, let's use a colon, and let's just say again, save. So now let's actually test out if it really works. So let's first of all again create a to-do. So let's say get some shoes. Let me click on submit. And now let me change the get some shoes to get some, I guess, bags. And if I now click on save, you should see right now the saving indicator, and you saw that for a second. I can now reload the page, and still it's still there. Now let me again change it to shoes. And if I again click on save, you will see for a second the saving, I guess, animation. Now there's one thing I don't like, and that's if I click on delete, there will be two things. First of all, we won't see the pending state, but if I also click on it, you saw that the saving button had a pending state, and that's not what I want. I want that the save button only has a pending state if I actually submit the form using this button. What I don't want to do is if I click the delete button, I don't want to show a pending state for my save button. I only want to show a pending state for my delete button. And that's and the problem comes because if I go back to this page.tsx inside of my beta, you will see that both buttons are inside of the same form element. And even though I did it at the start just to save some time and to be a bit faster, this has the disadvantage that both buttons are child components of the form, which means that both buttons get the same pending state. And that's of course not what I want. So to circumstance that, what we have to do is actually create two separate forms, and then with the two separate forms, I also get two separate pending states. So what I will now do is wrap my form right here inside of a separate div, and then this div will now have a key, and the key will be todo.id. I can delete now this key from my form, and now right here we have one form. Let me create another form right here, and then for now let me delete the action. And now inside of this form I will just have a button which is delete, so let me paste it inside of here. And now if you can remember, if I go to the action.ts, inside of our delete server action, we get an input ID. And now if I go back right now, inside of this form, we don't get an input ID. So let me just copy it from this other form and paste it also inside of here. So now we have two forms. One form will have a save button and the input for the type text, and the other form will have the delete button. So now I will change that. I won't need this form action anymore. I will just need a type, which will be of submit. So let me do that. And then I will give this form a separate action, and the action will now just be delete item. So now in theory, if I go back, let me again create a item, hello, how are you, and click on submit. You'll see that does not look good. So let's give this div right here a class name, which will be width of full, age of full, let's say flex, and items of center. If I now save that and go back, yeah, that now looks better. So now let's test it out. So if I change this to hey, how are we, I guess, and click on save, this still works. We still see the pending state. If I reload the page, we also still see the message. But if I now click on delete, the pending state should now not be anymore available to the save button. So let me click that, and yeah, you saw now the save button does not have any pending state anymore. So now let's do the same as we did for our save button also for the delete button. So let's go inside of our components and let's create a delete button.tsx. Let's do an export default function. Let's name it delete button and let me open that function. Now again, let's go to our page.tsx and let me just copy this button right now and let me do a return statement and paste it inside of here. Now again, what I want to do is get the pending state, and for that our component has to be a useClient component. So let's mark it on the top as useClient, and now right here I can now get the hook, so the useFormStatus hook, and through this hook I can now get the pending state. So let's do a constant, let's destructure pending from this object, and this will be equal to useFormStatus. Again, it should be useFormStatus and not useFormState. UseFormState is something completely different, and we will use it in a few moments. But for now, let's import useFormStatus, and that looks good. What I can do now is delete this delete text, and let's again use ternary. So if pending is true, let's return deleting ... And if this is false, let's use a colon, and let's just say delete. If I now save that and actually go to my page.tsx, and instead of this button, let's use our delete button component. And if I now go back and create a new input or a new to-do, So let's say, hey, get some milk. And if I click on submit, we now got our input right here with the two buttons. So let me again change it to, hey, get some bread. Let me click on save. Yes, we get the pending state, and we don't get the pending state in the delete button. And if I now delete it, we should not get our pending state in the save button, but just in the delete button. So let's do that, and you saw that worked perfectly. Now again, we're still not done. There's still two things that I don't like. First of all, our submit button still has no pending state, and our form does not reset. So let's change that. And for that, what I will actually do is break this form right here inside of a client component, or break it into a client component. So we will open our Explorer, go inside of our app folder, inside of the components folder, and create a new file called form.tsx. Now again, inside of here, we'll have to do an export default function, which will just be called form, element, and let me open that function. Inside of here, let's create a return statement, and then I will just return this whole form. So let me copy this form and paste it inside of here. Now inside of here, we get an error, and it tells me we have to import create. So let me import create from our .action. And now if I go back to my page.tsx, I can now use this component instead of this form. So let's import our form element from our components. Now still everything will work. We right now just broke our, our normal form inside of a component. So if I would go here and write something and click submit, you will still see everything works perfectly. But I think the first thing I want to do now is actually make the reset of the form work. And that's actually very easy. So first of all, I have to mark this component as useClient. And that's because I want to use a ref, so the useRef hook provided by React. And to make it work, it has to hydrate on the client side. And that's why I have to mark this component as useClient, because if I would not do that, we will get an error. So now let's do a constant called formRef, which will be equal to useRef, and useRef is imported from React. And let's give it an initial state of null. Then what I want to do is give the form a ref, and ref will just be equal to our form ref, which I've created right here. So what I want to do is with the ref is when I use my action, or if the action wants in that sense, I want to reset the form using my form ref. So I can then call formRef.current.reset. And for that, I will change it from right here create. So I right now pass it already a function, but instead of passing a function, I want to create a new async function inside of here. So a new async arrow function. And let me open that right here. And then inside of here, I can do await create. And you will see we get an error, and it tells me expected one argument, but got 0, an argument for form data was not provided. So through the params right here, we can get now form data, and form data will have the type of form data. So now I can pass my form data and everything will still work. But what I want to do now is, after I called my create function or my create server action, I want to also reset the form. And I can do that with formRef.current.reset. Now you saw we didn't get any types, and that's because I have to pass useRef a generic. So let's pass it a generic right now, which will be HTML form element. Now you see we get the types. So if I delete again this reset, I can do a dot, and now I get all of these options. So let's toggle reset, and now that looks good. So if I now save that and go back, you see an error. Wait, why do we have an error? Everything worked a second ago. Well, I was expecting this error because because we still haven't added one thing. So let's first of all go through this error. The error tells us it is not allowed to define inline useServer annotated server actions in client components. So what it means is, right now if I go to my action.ts, it tells me that I'm not allowed to make right here server actions inside of a client component. It also gives us a very nice solution, which is to use server actions inside of a client component. You can either export them from a separate file with useServer at the top or pass them through the props. So to make it more basic, to generalize it, what it tells me as a solution is just to mark this file, so this action.ts, as a useServer file. So if I go on top, I can just mark it now as useServer. And if I now save that and go back and reload the page, you will now see we don't get any error anymore. Now let's test out if everything works. So let's say again, get some milk. And if I click on submit, you see the form has been successfully resetted, and that looks great. Now what I want to do is create a submit or a pending state for our submit button. So let's do that. Let's go back to our form.tsx. And now inside of my form.tsx, what I can do is on top get our pending state. So let's do in const pending. So we destructure pending from the object, and this will be equal to use form status. And now what we can do inside of this button is just check if pending is true. So if pending is true, let me just return saving ... And if it's not true, let's use a colon and let's say save. Now the interesting thing is that I already know that we will have an error, but still I will show it to you. If I go back, let me reload to be sure that everything works. And let's now say, hey, does this have a pending state? And if I click on save, we don't have a pending state. So now the question arises, why does that not work? And I know the answer, and the answer is that we can't use the pending state inline if the button is of type submit. So let me make it a bit more generic. So right now we have a form element with a button which has type submit. And inside of this type submit button, I want to get a pending state. Well, this does not work because I have to break the submit button inside or to a separate client component. So if this button would just now be a normal button without type submit, it would work. But if it's a button of type submit, I have to break it into a separate component. Now you can either do it inside of here, since that's already a use client component, or you can create a new file. I will now just break it into a separate component inside of this file. So above the return statement, I will just create a new function called submit button, and I will open that function. And inside of here, I will now just return this button. So let me copy that and let me just return it inside of here. And then inside of the form element, instead of the button, I can use the submit function component. Now it will still not work because if I test it, hey, and click save, you still not see that. And that's because I have to use this hook inside of my function submit button component. So if I now use this hook inside of the component and test it again, so hey, how are you? You will now see a pending state. You saw save ... So you see now it fully works. And again, why is that? That's because always, if you have a button which is of type submit, you have to break it into a separate component, and this component also has to be a use client component. So now you see that works perfectly, which is great. And we can delete everything. I can change that again to shoes, save that, and that's great. Now there's one thing that does not work, and that's error handling. If I now go to my action.ts, and let's say I just had an error, and instead of Prisma, I said Prisma with multiple A's. If I now save that, go back and create a new, to do, and click on save, we get an error. But we don't get our custom error, but we get the default Next.js error. We don't want that. What we want is to just send our own custom error message. Now again, that's actually not very hard to do. So what we'll have to do is again go to our form.tsx, and now right here under our form ref, we will now have to use a new hook. And this hook will now be the use form state hook. With the use form state hook, I can handle errors and show them in the UI. So what you will do is use a constant, and inside of here we will now pretty much set it like a normal state. So we'll have a state, and let's also do a form action, and this will be equal to use form state, not use form status, but use form state. Now this use form state will actually get two params. So first of all, we will get the function, so our server action, which is called create, and we'll have an initial state. So let's pass our server action called create, and our initial state is just null. Now, right now we get an error, and that's fine. We will change that in a second. So now we right here have created a hook called use form state, and then inside of here we have a getter and a setter. So with the state, I just get the current state or the message in that sense. And with the form message, I can then just create my, action, or post my request to my action. And then I have my use form state hook, and then I have to pass two params, and that's first of all the server action and then the initial state. Now we get an error right here, and let's change that. And to change that, you have to go to your action.ts. And now this is interesting. Right here in the params, I now have to get one more thing, which is the previous state. This will now just be any. And if I now save that and go back, you will now see that the error has gone. And now again, you have to do that since we have an initial state of null, and I want to now set it to the previous state. You don't really have to understand why that is. I find it a bit complex, but you will just have to pass a previous state. You also don't have to use it inside of here. Just get the previous state to the param, set it to any, and then it will work perfectly. Now still we get an error right here. If you scroll down, you right here see await, create, and we see in red squiggly line. Well, that's because you now don't want to call the create function directly right here, but you want to use the form actions. So let's delete this whole await, and let's just call form action, and let's pass our form data inside of here. So let me do that, form data. And now you see we don't get any errors anymore, so that looks good. What we can do now is go to our action.ts, and what I want to do now is create a try catch statement. And then if we catch an error, I want to return a error message. So let me wrap everything in a try statement. So let's do a try, and let's do also right here a catch. We'll get a error. Let me open that, and that's fine. Now inside of our try statement, let me copy everything. So this revalidate path right to the input, and let me paste it inside of the try statement. That looks good. And if we catch something, so if we catch an error, let me just do a return, and let's say failed to create. If I now save that and go back, I want to now show our error message. So under the submit button, I can now get my state, and let's do an as string. So now if in theory, we should now catch our error through this try catch statement, then I will return this message, and we should see it through our state right here. So let's test it out. Let's say, hey, do we see the error? Let me click on save, and yeah, you see failed to create. You can also make it more pronounced, so we can wrap it inside of a p tag. Let's give it a class name of text red 500, and let me paste it again. And let's again try to create something, or let's first of all reload the page. And then let's say again, hey, how are you? Let me click on save, and you see fail to create. So our error handling now fully works, which is great. Let me now again spell Prisma correct to see if everything still works. So new to do, let me click on save, and yes, it works perfectly. So now you have learned everything about server actions. You have learned how to create server actions. You have learned how to handle the pending state. You have learned how to handle errors, or in that sense also how to catch them and show them in the UI. And you have also learned how to reset the form. So now you know actually everything about server actions. And now the last thing we can do is actually push our code to GitHub and then deploy it to Vercel. So let's do that right now. So I'm now at github.com/new. So let's now create a new repository name. Let's name it Next.js 14 server actions-yt. Let me make it public and let's click on create repository. Now right here you will see instructions how to create our Git repository. So let's do that right now. So now before we push our code to GitHub, what I want you to do is open your .gitignore, and then inside of here you will add your .env. Why do we do that? That's because I don't want to deploy my .env to my GitHub public repository, so I don't want people to see my environment variables. So what do we do now? We open our terminal. Inside of here, let's do a git init. This will initialize a new Git repository. Let's do a git add everything with a dot, so git add dot. Then let's do a git commit -m, and for the message, let's say finished project. Let's click enter, and then if we go back to GitHub, let's right here copy this git branch m main. Let's paste that inside of here. Let's copy the remote origin. Let's copy that and paste that. And then let's push our code. So let me copy that and paste that. If you now see, we now push our code to GitHub. And if I reload my page at GitHub right here, you now see the code, which is great. So now let's go to Vercel and deploy our code. So I'm now on Vercel, and you can now just import right here this project, which is Next.js 14 server actions. So let me click on import. And now before we click on deploy, right here in the environment variables, go back to your .env file and copy the database URL, copy that, and then paste it inside of here. Now you can click on deploy, and as you will see now, the project will be deployed to Vercel. Now, if you want to see how the building process looks, you can open right here this building tab, and you will see how that looks. So once that's done, I will come back. So not even, I guess, 20 seconds have passed and we already get an error. And right here we see an error. Prisma has detected that this project was built on Vercel, which builds which caches dependencies. This leads to an outdated Prisma client because Prisma's auto generation isn't triggered. To fix this, run Prisma generate, blah, blah, blah. So what you can do right now is follow this URL, and I've already opened that. So since we use Vercel, Vercel automatically caches dependencies, which leads to that the Prisma client's auto generation isn't triggered. And to prevent that, what you can do is right here scroll to solution, and we can use a custom post installed script. So let me copy this post installed script. Let me go back. Let's open our package.json. And then right here inside of our scripts under lint, I can just paste that inside of here. Now let's open our terminal. Let me clear everything. Let's do a git add everything with a dot, git commit -m, and let's just say added Prisma script. And then let's click enter, and let's do a git push. This will now push our code to GitHub, and Vercel will automatically rebuild our project. So our application has now been successfully deployed. So let me click right here on domains. And now we are on the original example. So let's go to /beta to see the nicer example. And now I'm on /beta. So one thing you should know before we actually test it out is that this project is completely static. So we didn't add any revalidate tags or anything. This is completely static and only works with the caching. So we actually, with this revalidate path function, we just manipulate the cache to reset it. And this is why this example is very fast, because we don't refetch anything and everything is always static. So now with that out of the way, let's test out this example. So let's create a new to-do. Let's say, hey, get some shoes. Let's click on save. we see our pending state right here, and this takes a bit. That's because we use serverless function and we have some cold starts. Now let's change our to-do to hey get some milk. Let's click on save. We have the pending state and we have now hey get some milk. Let me also delete that, and as you see it has been deleted. So that looks good. Let me also change that. Let's click on save. We have the pending state. If I reload it, it's also still persisted. So that's great. So now you see our project is fully working. So this is very nice, and I hope you could also learn a lot from this video. And if you enjoyed it, please like it and subscribe. And with that out of the way, I hope I see you on the next video. So now, bye.